I want to welcome everybody. My name is Craig Thiel. I'm the research director here at the Citizens Research Council. We're hosting a webinar today to examine our most recent research report on public education, higher education finances in Michigan and across the United States. This research effort was led by Robert Schneider, who you will be hearing from very shortly. I just want to take this time to thank you for taking the time out of your busy day and as Bob explores the major findings from his report. Before we jump into the material, allow me to provide a quick overview of the Citizens Research Council for those who may not be familiar with our organization. The CRC is a statewide, nonpartisan public affairs research group. This is our 106th year of operation, a longevity that we attribute to our promotion of sound public policy for state and local governments through accurate, independent, and objective research. We're a private, not-for-profit organization, and we rely on the charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, corporations, and individuals. I'd like to encourage you all to join our circle of supporters and help us to continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan. If you value this webinar and the other work of the Research Council, please consider a contribution. A handout file with the slides for this event, for Bob's presentation, for you to follow along, can be downloaded from our webpage. If you want to navigate to the CRC webpage and click under events, you will find this webinar and the slide deck. I'll make a note that we have everyone but Bob on mute, so we'll not be able to hear you if you speak. If you have a question, however, we will be taking questions at the end of Bob's presentation, and there is a question pane within the GoToWebinar software that you can use, and we'll get those throughout and answer those at the end of the webinar. Also, after the webinar, you're going to be receiving an email soliciting your feedback. We'd be very appreciative if you could provide any feedback on the webinar. So before I get into the formal introduction to Bob, I want to just take a personal moment and share that Bob and I have been working together for 26 years now. It was January of 1997 when Bob and I both applied for an opening at the House Fiscal Agency. Bob got the job, I didn't. But fortunately for me, soon after that, another opening happened and I was hired. I joined in January of 97, so this January marks the 26th year that Bob and I first met. And for the most of that period, Bob and I have been co-workers, either at the House Fiscal Agency or here at the CRC. I just want to say that I'm proud to work with Bob as a colleague and as a friend. So here are Bob's bona fides. He has extensive background in all things state finance related. He's served in fiscal leadership roles in the House of Representatives as a deputy director at the House Fiscal Agency and has nearly 5 years experience as a deputy in the state budget office as well. Bob's been with the CRC over 2 stints, almost 10 years. He has experience here working on several different research projects ranging from early childhood to state tax policy to transportation and much more. We're extremely fortunate to have Bob's wealth of experience and knowledge to lean on here at CRC, and he was the perfect person to lead this research effort. And with that, I'm going to turn the controls over to Bob and his presentation.
Thank you so much, Craig. Let me see if I can advance my slide here, and I do. Thank you for that very kind introduction from my co-worker and longtime friend, Mr. Thiel. I appreciate that very much. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here today to talk with you about our new report, which I think is an important one. I'm so glad you could join us. I'm going to start right out today with a brief outline of our goals for this report, and then talk real briefly about the data that we used in the report. So we looked at 30 years of available federal data on public universities and public community colleges, and we sort of had four goals for the research. First, we wanted to document how much tuition has grown over time and how affordability has changed in terms of the financial bite that tuition takes out of a typical family budget, a typical family income. Then we wanted to look at some, what could be driving the increase that we see in tuition. We're going to look at institutional spending, how has per student spending changed, and to what extent has changes in university and college per student spending helped drive up tuition rates. And then public institutions also receive operating support from the government, particularly state governments. And in the report, we refer to that as the public subsidy, public operating support, state appropriations, local millage, dedicated millages to community colleges that help subsidize tuition. How have changes in that public subsidy, public support revenue impacted tuition? And then finally, we know that posted tuition charges are effectively the sticker price for college and university studies. Many students receive financial aid, and we'll take a look at how financial aid access and grant aid has affected the affordability of tuition charges. The data from our report come entirely from the U.S. Department of Education. That the U.S. Department of Ed has a integrated post-secondary education data system, and data is compiled through annual surveys. We draw on, for this report, financial data, tuition spending, public subsidy revenue from 471 public universities and 680 public community colleges around the country. That includes all 15 Michigan universities and all 28 of our Michigan community colleges. So let's move to some of the key findings of the report. The first is that tuition is becoming much less affordable for the average student and family. And we're going to take a look at both universities and community colleges here. First, let's look at our universities. And sorry, I have a little problem with my screen, so give me just a second here. So this chart shows full-time in-state undergraduate tuition and fees for public universities. And we note average annual growth for Michigan universities, for U.S. universities, very similar, 6.2% annually. Annual growth for Michigan public universities, 6.3% for all U.S. public universities. So growth rates very similar. We do notice, and the chart highlights it, there's a consistent difference in the level of tuition across our 30 years from 1989 to 2019 that we examined. If we look at academic year AY 2019, that's academic year 2019, average tuition was about 40% higher in Michigan than across the country on average. That's a significant gap that we'll talk about a little bit later. Turning to the community colleges, annual growth in tuition and fees over the 30 years was slightly less. For Michigan community colleges, 4.5%. For all community colleges nationally, about 5.3%. So we see a little bit of a gap between Michigan and its national counterparts, but not much of one. In 2019, Michigan Community College tuition was about a little over 6.5% above the national average. But the difference between the Michigan and the U.S. institutions is not as significant as what we saw with the universities. So what about affordability? We wanted to look at affordability, and we did that by looking at those in-state tuition and fee charges in this slide for public universities as a percent of median income. And our goal was to again look at how much of a bite is tuition taking out of a typical household income. And we see both in Michigan for Michigan institutions and across the country, tuition is taking a larger bite out of those budgets, out of that typical income. If we look at Michigan universities in academic year 89, tuition, in-state tuition was 7.4% of median income. It grew over the next 30 years to over 21% of median income. Nationally, pretty much the same story. The growth was from 5.4% to just over 14%. So really almost threefold growth in that measure of tuition as a percentage of median income, a pretty substantial decrease in affordability. For the community colleges, the story was the same in terms of at least the slope of these lines, but the degree to which affordability change was a little less. So, for Michigan community colleges, if we look at that same metric in district full-time tuition and fees this time as a percent of median income, we see growth from 89 at 3.2% to about 5.8% in 2019. So not quite doubling the degree to which affordability worsened. And again, for national community colleges, the line stays pretty consistent with the Michigan institutions, growing from 2.6% to 5.1%. So affordability declined for community colleges, proportionally low. The change was less than for universities. Now we also did look at individual Michigan institutions and compare those institutions to their national peers in terms of both tuition growth and tuition levels. If you look at the report itself, it has some tables that show these comparisons. Just in summary, we saw for Michigan's public universities, all 15 had charges that exceeded their average for their Carnegie class peers in academic year 2019. And about 11 of the 15 had annual growth rates over the full 30 years that exceeded the peer group average. For community colleges, a little more diversity here. Tuition charges were still, for the most part, above the national average. 23 of the 28 Michigan community colleges had charges that exceeded the national community college average. About a little less than half had growth rates that exceeded that 30-year growth rate. So again, tuition a little higher level-wise in Michigan, in growth rates a little bit more of a diversity of experience. So, in summary, the data show tuition growth has generally outpaced income growth for both universities and for community colleges. The remainder of the report sort of focuses on the why. And we know public institutions rely on two key revenue sources to help finance educational programming: tuition and fees. And tuition and fees can come directly from students and families. It can also come from financial aid grants, federal, state, local, private financial aid, and we'll be talking about financial aid later. And then importantly, that public subsidy that we just talked about, public operating support, state appropriations for universities, state appropriations to community colleges, dedicated local millage revenue to community colleges. And again, we call that the public subsidy in this report. At a high level, our premise here is a tuition can grow for two reasons. One, it needs to keep up with institutional spending. So an entity with higher per student educational spending growth is going to need more revenue, and that's going to put by itself upward pressure on tuition. But since we have two revenue sources here, another important factor could be that growth in public operating support, the public subsidy growth that we talk about in the report. If public operating support grows slower than spending trends, that's also going to put upward pressure on tuition to try to make up the difference. If I'm only getting 1% out of my one pot, and I want to grow by 3%, I need to increase the other pot, which would be tuition much higher. So we tried to take a look at different, both the spending and the public subsidy factor. And first, we look at institutional spending at universities and community colleges. Clearly, this is an important factor. in determining tuition growth. But our findings suggest it doesn't tell the whole story. Let me talk about the spending data that we used in our analysis. So our goal was to identify education spending that would be financed in whole or in part by tuition and that public operating support, the kind of the spending that that would be covered by those key revenue sources, education related spending. So we didn't want costs related to research institutes or grant funded programs with a separate funding source, or for instance, university hospital systems. What we looked at were these two broad categories: instruction and student services spending. So that's the most direct instructional spending, faculty salaries, but also education related services to students, an admissions office, healthcare for students, student organizations. And then secondly, we looked at a slightly broader measure of administration and support services spending that would be overhead-like costs that it would at least be partially allocable to tuition and fee revenue and public support. So things like general administrative functions, finance offices, legal offices, academic support, dean's offices, libraries, museums, the executive offices of a university, and operations and maintenance and in terms of facilities, upkeep, insurance and utility costs. So when we compare per student spending growth to tuition and fee growth, we see tuition growth is uniformly higher over these 3 decades. This table looks at for universities, both in Michigan and nationally, for community colleges, both in Michigan and nationally, those annual per student spending growth in both those key areas we just talked about, and compare them to tuition and fee growth. For universities, annual spending growth is significantly lower than tuition growth. We see, let's just look at the example of Michigan universities. Michigan Public University's average annual growth was about 6.2%. We see both measures of spending per student growing, instructional at 3.5%, administration and support services at 4.3%. And that trend largely holds across all 4 types of entities we look at here. The gap between tuition and spending growth is a little narrower for community colleges, but it's still there. So, tuition and fee growth on an annual basis has grown faster than spending. And for universities in particular, the gap is fairly pronounced. We wanted to do a double check. We wanted to make sure that our measures here weren't too tied to our start date in 1989. So we did another look. Instead of going all the way back to 89, we did a 15-year look from 2004 to 2019. Does that gap still exist over that shorter time frame? And the answer is, and again, is yes. I'll toggle between the two. You'll see here's 89 to 2019. Here's 2004 to 2019. The growth rate's slow, a little bit for everything. Tuition's a little slower, spending is a little slower, but we still see that gap that exists. Tuition and fee annual growth is substantially higher than what we see for per student education spending growth. So our conclusion here in looking at that data is spending is only part of the story. Does institutional spending per student help drive tuition growth? Certainly it does. It's what tuition funds. But spending alone can't account for the observed changes we saw in tuition and fee charges. Something else is factoring in here. So we move next to examine historical changes to that public operating support, the other major source of education revenue, and what we're calling the public subsidy for public universities and community colleges. And we find it's played an important role as a tuition driver, and that's been especially true for our 4-year universities. So let's just take a look at public operating support growth compared to tuition over the 30-year period that we examined. And you see, this is for Michigan universities. The table shows Michigan universities, U.S. universities, and then Michigan and U.S. community colleges. And I'm going to just look at the annual percentage, average percentage changes. Notice for the universities in particular, the public subsidy revenue per student grew quite slowly. For Michigan universities over those 30 years, the average annual growth rate was less than 0.5%, just over 1% for universities. And notice then, if you look at the gross tuition revenue, that's revenue from students, families, financial aid, all together. The tuition revenue grew much more significantly, about 6.5%, give or take a little, for both Michigan and U.S. universities. So much more tuition growth than public subsidy revenue growth. Also a gap for community colleges, but the gap's a little slower. For Michigan community colleges, for example, tuition revenue per student grew 5.3% per year. Public subsidy revenue about 4.3% per year. So now we look at combined education growth in this slide from both the tuition and the subsidy. And just an important note here. So for U.S. universities, when we look at the combined education revenue from both sources, over the 30 years that for U.S. universities, that grew at about 3.5% at an annual rate. For Michigan universities, about 3.9% annual rate. Notice that's similar in nature to not surprisingly, that's a similar growth rate to what we saw in those broad spending measures, since this education revenue would need to fund much of that spending. So total growth was more consistent with spending, but as we saw on the prior slide, the two components grew much differently. And let's take a look at what that's meant in terms of the public subsidy share of that education revenue for universities. So for U.S. universities, when we began the data analysis for academic year 1989, the public subsidy, that public operating support, made up 73% of that total revenue. Fast forward 30 years, that shrunk from 73% to 35%. U.S. universities became much more tuition dependent, and the same is true for Michigan universities, and actually the magnitude of the decline is even stronger. The public subsidy share of education revenue for Michigan universities was 61% in 1989. By 2019, that had shrunk to 22%. The tuition share, on the other hand, grew from about 38% and really doubled to almost 78% by 2019. A really big shift in the source of revenue on which universities are financing their education programs. Looking at the same combined education revenue for community colleges, again, we see for U.S. community colleges, annual growth was about 3.7% over the 30 years. For Michigan community colleges, about 4.6%. Again, in line with the spending factors that we examined earlier. But since the gap between subsidy growth and tuition growth was less for community colleges, we saw much less of a decline in the public subsidy share of that revenue. So looking at U.S. community colleges, still went down because the public subsidy growth was smaller than the tuition growth, but the subsidy share went from about 77% in '89 down to 61% in 2019. And the decline was less even for Michigan community colleges. If we look back to 1989, that academic year, about 68%. By 2019, at the end of the 30-year period, the public subsidy share had shrunk to about 61%. So proportionally, public subsidy share went down for community colleges, but by to a much lesser degree than what we saw for universities. So one important factor for community colleges, and here we look at Michigan community college information, we break the public subsidy up into two components: what came from the state appropriations to community colleges, and what came from local millage, dedicated millages for community college operations. And we'll see that one helper, at least in helping support higher growth in public subsidy revenue for community colleges, in this documents it for Michigan, is that local funding grew significantly more quickly. So if we look at annual growth rates for state-based funding, the state appropriations grew by a little under 3%, still much higher than for universities, but more constrained than the local millage revenue, which on average over the 30 years grew by about 5.6%, a little more than 5.5%. Now, obviously, the Great Recession that occurred, in 2009, 2010, 2011, that had a factor in affecting that millage growth. But over the full 30 years, we see that added funding source has been a boon for community colleges and helped support stronger growth in the public subsidy. So we've documented the relatively slow growth in public subsidy revenue and then the significant decline in the public subsidy share of education revenue that went with that. But can we say that there's a direct causal relationship between a declining subsidy share and tuition growth? Well, it's maybe, but maybe not. And so we present sort of a hypothetical scenario here to sort of illustrate. So let's look at a public institution. Let's say this is a public university, and that university gets 50% of its education revenue from tuition and the other 50% from the public subsidy. And that university seeks to maintain overall revenue growth of about 3.5% per year, which is roughly consistent with what we saw as a long-term trend for that revenue growth. So this year, the public subsidy revenue, that one component, only grows by 1%. Well, what's the institution do? And really, there's two choices. The institution, if its overall goal is to generate 3.5% growth in its education revenue in order to support its desired growth in spending and programming, it's going to need to raise tuition by 6% to offset the slower growth in the public subsidy revenue. Public subsidy, half my revenue is growing by 1%. And I want the total revenue to go 3.5%, then tuition has to go up by 6% to get me to 3.5% overall growth. But that's not the only choice. If there's recognition that, well, you know what, we have slow public subsidy growth this year, another option is let's accept just a little lower overall revenue growth. We want 3.5%, but maybe we can make do with 2.5% or 3%. That allows the institution to raise tuition by something less than the full 6%. And so a declining public, and in both these cases, the public subsidy share would be declining. But in one case, the decline in the public subsidy share would be sort of totally funded through a tuition increase. And in the other case, we'd have a mixed strategy. Well, we'll do with less total revenue growth, and that'll help mitigate the tuition impact. Well, what's the reality? We wanted to look across all community colleges and all universities to get an idea of what patterns we found in the data. So this table looks at community colleges. And again, what we did was we separated the community colleges into 4 quartiles based on the decline in public subsidy share experienced by community colleges. The top quartile there then is the 25%, the top 25% of community colleges that had the largest declines in that public subsidy share. The lowest quartile, on the other hand, is the 25% of community colleges that experienced the least decline in the public subsidy share. And the second and third quartiles are in the middle. What patterns do we see? So not surprisingly, the community colleges with the greatest public subsidy share declines tended to have higher tuition growth. And we have in-district, posted in-district charges here and actual per student tuition revenue in both those columns. So tuition revenue was higher for the top quartile than the lower quartiles. Public subsidy revenue was lower for the top quartile than the lowest quartile, not surprising. But then the key question, what about the total revenue? And we see, as we talked about in the last slide, it's sort of a mix. Here, the community colleges that experienced the largest subsidy share decline also pushed down their total education growth. They did what we illustrated on that last slide. Some of the impact of the public subsidy decline was felt through higher tuition, but some of it was also tamping the brakes on education revenue growth. We did we did with less, and presumably then had to slow our spending somewhat. So we have a mixed strategy that we see among the community colleges. What about the universities? And here's an important finding. So we did the same thing, 4 quartiles based on the decline in public subsidy share. And again, these are all median annual growth rates for each quartile. We see similar patterns for the universities with tuition. Tuition growth, both actual tuition and in-state posted charges, were highest for the top quartile. And again, public subsidy growth was lowest for the top quartile, and then got progressively higher as we went through the second, third, and lowest quartile. But what about education revenue? And here we see a different result than what we saw for the community colleges. Education revenue growth didn't vary discernibly across the 4 quartiles. As you might expect, the lowest quartile, the universities that experienced the smallest decline in public subsidy share, had the highest median education revenue, combined education revenue growth from both the subsidy and tuition, but the second highest was the top quartile. So we didn't see any discernible trend in terms of the quartiles. That really suggests that for universities at least, most of the decline in the public subsidy share that was experienced, and remember it was a very significant decline both nationally and in Michigan, were met through high adjustments to tuition charges that we see in the data here. That's a very important finding, and it really suggests we do some analytics in the report to show what does that mean for what that declining subsidy share means for the affordability challenge that we saw for universities. Here again, we look at per student tuition revenue as a percent of median income. Just a quick note, earlier we were looking at the posted typical charge. Here we're actually looking at actual per student tuition revenue. That would include not just undergraduate, but graduate revenue. It wouldn't include just in-state, but out-state, all tuition revenue to universities, because that was the data that was available to analyze in this aspect of the report. So the blue line here is actual per student revenue, and we see, like the charges that we saw earlier, they went up in this case more than threefold, from 10% in academic year '89 all the way up to 32% in academic year 2019. Then we look at an adjusted growth tuition construct, and that looks at, all right, what if we start in '89 with actual tuition, but we only grow that tuition by the growth necessary to maintain that public subsidy and tuition share of revenue. So in other words, if the public subsidy share had remained at 61%, which is where it was at for Michigan public universities in 1989, what would tuition growth had looked like? That means we would have gotten more public operating support growth, and tuition could have come down, because that looks like the trade-off for universities. So if that public subsidy share had remained at 61%, that would have generated an extra over $10,000 per student in state funding on average to our Michigan universities, and that would have allowed tuition to grow not all the way to 32%, but tuition under this model would have been about 16% of median income, because we presume, like we saw in the national trend data, that higher public subsidy growth would have helped keep those tuition costs down. So the analytics here really suggest about 75% of the increase in tuition as a percentage of median income, that metric of affordability, really was driven by that decline in the public subsidy share. Only about 25% was tuition keeping up with that long run trend in total education revenue. So that's a very significant finding. We also kind of wanted to look at tax effort for a higher education. How much of our tax base are we providing as a public through our tax dollars to support higher education? And tax effort, as we define it here, is the total public subsidy revenue to universities and to community colleges, state appropriations, local millage revenue for community colleges, that total public subsidy revenue as a percent of personal income. Personal income serves as sort of a proxy for our tax base then. What percent of our income is passed to public institutions as operating grants through our tax dollars, with personal income as sort of a gauge of our tax base? And that's an important question because it kind of determines what's happening, what's leading to the decline in public subsidy share of revenue that especially we see for universities. And there's two stories here. So if public subsidy share of revenue is going down because institutional revenue demands, institutional revenue growth is outpacing our tax base, our personal income, then in a sense, government's kind of between a rock and a hard place. We can't keep the share constant without either raising taxes or cutting somewhere else. And in this case, if that was what's happening, we should see the tax effort for higher education being fairly stable, or maybe even growing if we're raising taxes to keep pace. Alternatively, it might be that the subsidy, the slow subsidy growth is the result of just a conscious decision to sort of constrain tax revenue for higher education. Either we want lower overall tax burdens, or we're shifting revenue, public revenue that went to higher education to other budget priorities. And in this case, if that's the story here, tax effort would be falling for higher education over time. So what did we see in the data? And again, this is looking at all community colleges, all universities in the federal database, and it's looking at public subsidy operating support as a percentage of personal income from academic year 1989 to academic year 2019. And we see a very different picture for community colleges and universities. For the universities, that tax effort, public subsidy as a percent of personal income, fell for Michigan universities from about 0.6% of personal income in 89 all the way down to about 0.3% of personal income in 2019. So basically, tax effort cut in half, for slightly more than half for Michigan universities. And nationally, the story looks a whole lot similar. And in fact, the end point is the same for Michigan and U.S. universities. We're at about 0.3% of personal income being devoted through tax dollars to public operating support to universities. That's a significant decline. And again, it helps show much of that decline then in public subsidy, the slow growth and the decline in the subsidy share that we saw over the 30 years can really be attributed to just a conscious reduction in the tax effort for universities. We don't see that with the community colleges. Really, the tax effort for community colleges has stayed pretty level for both Michigan community colleges and community colleges nationally. And we see if we have the bullet there, if we had maintained the tax effort at the academic year 1989 level in Michigan, that would have, so if we still devoted 0.6% rather than 0.3% of our personal income to universities, that would have raised per student public subsidy revenue from the real number, 58, 52, to over $12,000, a really significant change in that component of education revenue. Okay, so we'll close the webinar by taking a look at another important factor that could affect tuition affordability: financial aid grants. And remember, we talked about Earlier, as we talked about tuition trends, we were talking about, posted in-state full-time tuition and fees, for instance, for universities. We know that posted tuition is kind of a sticker price. Many students, many families don't pay that full sticker price. Financial aid comes in and helps further subsidize tuition. So we wanted to look at what is the impact of financial aid on affordability, and what we find is financial aid grants have helped, but not enough to mitigate the changes that we saw in affordability over the 30 years in full. So just really quick, financial aid discounts to tuition charges. As we said, not all students pay the full sticker price, full freight. For universities, 73% of first-time, full-time undergraduates received grant aid in academic year 2019. 64% of community college students did the same. Within the IPED's federal database, a significant enhancement in data was made in around 2004 that break out gross tuition, the total tuition revenue coming from either families, students, financial aid, into two components. Net tuition revenue, which is the actual amount received and paid by students and families. And again, this could be from income, this could be from student loan proceeds, it could be from work study wages that the student earns, but the student family contribution is net tuition revenue. That nets out from the gross tuition the financial aid discount, the component of tuition charges that are covered through financial aid grads, whether they be from federal sources, state sources, institutional revenue, private grants. So let's look at the relative growth in net tuition and then financial aid discounts per FTE student. And we'll see for both universities and community colleges, financial aid grant awards have grown faster than what we saw for tuition. So let's look at the universities. Michigan universities, financial aid discounts per student grew by 8.2% annually over the 15 years now that we're looking at with available data. For the US universities, just a little under 8%. We also had significant growth for the community colleges, a little over 7%, a little under 7% for Michigan community colleges and universities. That allows, on the other side of the table, net tuition, the out-of-pocket tuition charges, to grow slower. Remember, for Michigan universities, we said tuition charges were growing around 6% for Michigan and national universities. The net tuition grew a little slower, about 5.2% annually for Michigan universities, net tuition revenue per student. For US universities, about 5.1%. The community colleges, for US community colleges, a pretty significant drop to 3.4%. Michigan community colleges were a little bit of the outlier. Michigan and US universities look a lot alike. Michigan community colleges, financial aid helped, but net tuition still went up significantly more in Michigan than it did for community colleges nationally. And that's an important finding. And we'll explore a potential factor in what may be driving that just in a moment. So what does that mean going back to our look at affordability? And so let's go to the university side. Remember, we looked before at tuition charges as a percentage of median family income. And just as we saw earlier, the blue line is gross tuition, total tuition revenue as a percentage per student as a percentage of median income. And then we look separately at net tuition, what actually was the out-of-pocket expenses coming from students and families. And we see that the net tuition change in terms of net tuition as a percentage of median income, that slope of those lines are a little less. So financial aid helped mitigate some of that decline in affordability that we see by this growth in tuition charges as a percentage of median income, but not all of it. So at Michigan universities, even after we factor in financial aid, we would have started academic year 2004 at about 17.5% net tuition as a percentage of median income, still went up to almost 25%. Financial aid helped, but it didn't mitigate the affordability challenge that we saw. Slightly different story for community colleges, at least at the national level. So if we see here for U.S. community colleges over these 15 years between 2004 and 2019, gross tuition got less affordable. It grew as a percentage of median income, but financial aid kind of tamped out most of that growth. When we look at net tuition, out-of-pocket revenue as a percentage of median income, it only grew from 4.2% to 4.5% over those 15 years. Financial aid helped knock out most of the decline in affordability for community colleges nationally. That was, again, less true for Michigan community colleges. The gross tuition charges went up, as we saw earlier, over the 15 years. The net tuition went up by a little less, from 5.4% to 7.4%. But unlike the community colleges nationally, the net tuition went up, proportionally much more. And financial aid was helpful, but much less helpful in stamping out the decline in affordability that we see by this rising per student revenue as a percentage of median income measure. We think one significantly contributing factor to that was some major reductions in state financial aid that occurred back in fiscal year 2010 as the state was fighting very severe effects of the Great Recession, which quite frankly followed about 10 years of very challenging budget times in Michigan, even before the Great Recession hit. But in 2010, there were some significant reductions to state-based financial aid programs that affected both universities and community colleges. The biggest one was the elimination of the Michigan Promise Grant program. That was an $80 million budget cut to help shore up budget shortfalls that were seen at that time. Eliminated a program that at the time was awarding up to $4,000 in grants to Michigan students. The other major reduction was a $46 million reduction in state competitive scholarship and Michigan tuition grant programs. Maximum awards for both those programs were reduced to save almost another $50 million to contribute towards the really big budget shortfalls we were seeing at that time. Eligibility was also curtailed in those programs to help achieve savings. Overall, almost $140 million was cut from state-based financial aid programs, a 64% decline from the prior year levels. A really major reduction to state-based financial aid, and we see the impact. So these final slides, we'll take a look at who gets financial aid and how that's changed. And note, this goes from academic year 2009 to 2019. So before and after those major state cuts to financial aid. At community colleges, U.S. community colleges, almost 63% of first-time, full-time undergraduate students were receiving financial aid grants in 2009. Per a national trend, that actually rose to 70% by 2019. In Michigan, the opposite happened. We were a fairly generous state in 2009. 85% of students received community college first-time, full-time students received aid. That shrunk to 64%. And you see the same trend with universities, although maybe to a slightly lesser magnitude. U.S. universities, the percent receiving grant aid nationally went up, and Michigan universities didn't follow the national trend. We went from a very generous state to having a decline, actually, in the total percentage of first-time, full-time students who received aid. And again, these last couple slides will show financial aid was, those state-based declines were a major factor. This looks at the university side. Again, for U.S. universities, if we look at the blue shaded state and local percentages in 2004. Between 2004 2009, the percentage of first-time full-time students getting state and local based financial aid grew on a national basis. In Michigan, very much the opposite, which was true. In 2004, 55+% of students received state and local based financial aid. By 2019, that was less than 12%. For universities, they were able to tap into institutional aid to a greater degree to help mitigate some of that decline, but we still saw overall less access to financial aid grants. For community colleges, exactly the same story. National trend is state and local grant aid becoming more available, from 24 to almost 39% of first-time full-time undergraduates. In Michigan, again, those big financial aid cuts in 2004, we had 36% of first-time full-time community college students in Michigan receiving state and local aid. That shrunk almost in half to about 19% by 2019. So those big financial aid reductions from 2010 had significant impacts on financial aid availability, in probably prevented financial aid from having as much, especially for community colleges, as much of a mitigating factor on affordability. So we're going to close today with public policy implications, and just a quick slide to talk about what this all means. I think what we've shown is reversing affordability, the affordability challenges that we show is going to require public investments in public higher education. And there are different ways to do that. Clearly, one option is to reverse that 30-year trend we saw in the data of slow public operating support to public institutions. That would especially apply to universities where that growth was especially constrained. But there are a couple challenges to that now today. First, universities in particular are much more tuition dependent. Public subsidy revenue makes up a much smaller, as we saw, share of education revenue. So a 5 or 10% growth in any given year of public operating support, it's going to have less bang for the buck on tuition, because public operating support is a much smaller share of that revenue. That's going to mean you're going to need bigger and bigger increases in public subsidy support, to get that bang for the buck. Another challenge is, as we kind of saw with community colleges, with increases in operating support, it's very possible, maybe even likely, that as you re-up and make major investments in operating grants, that some of that leaks, we're going to see some tuition impact, but also you're going to see that some of it's going to go to support per student spending increase. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. There are some studies that show that higher per student spending, has positive impacts on things like graduation rates and things. But if the aim is affordability, as we go back up and increase operating grants, we probably get some leakage into spending. Another option, of course, is to increase public investments in state-based financial aid, and we saw that major reduction in 2010. We've already taken some steps recently to do just that. Many of you might be familiar. In the most recent budget, $250 million was added to create a new Michigan Achievement Scholarships program. And that is a major amount of money to help actually probably more than offset those financial aid reductions that we talked about from 2010. We also have the Michigan Reconnect program that has helped bump up aid very significantly for community college studies. So both those recent financial aid innovations, which come after our data, the end of our data analysis, are going to have that kind of impact. And the size, especially those Michigan Achievement Scholarships, is probably sufficient to significantly move the needle in terms of reversing, some of the declines we saw in public financial aid investment earlier in 2010. So with that, I am going to wrap up. Thank you so much again. I hope this information was helpful. You can find the full report on our website. Pleasure speaking to you all today. Thank you so much for taking time out to join our webinar today. And I'm going to shoot it back over to Craig to see if we had any questions come through, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, Bob, it appears you've answered everyone's questions, because we didn't get any questions. But don't fret, Bob's available. He's got his, well, no, he doesn't. He doesn't have his email here, but you can reach Bob through the website address here if something comes up after the webinar here in terms of a question, something that spiked your interest, and he'll get back with you. I just want to thank everyone for taking the time today to get on the webinar. Just a friendly reminder that we will send out a quick survey soliciting your feedback about what went well, what didn't. We welcome all comments and suggestions for improvement. And with that, I'm going to wish everyone a great afternoon and a great weekend to come here. Thank you very much. This ends the webinar.